We are Irish Side of the Moon. Freedom of information, personal empowerment. The Irish Side of the Moon.
I still have a dream.
There are many sources of energy available.
Everything is energy. My God, do we need this war? Free our minds.
Corporations have taken over the world.
Freedom of information, personal empowerment. The Irish Side of the Moon.
Hello, once again you're very welcome to the Irish Side of the Moon. This is Michael Letty at the microphone for this week's show, and you're very welcome. As I say, this is number 82, interview number 82 on the Irish Side of the Moon. It's hard to believe we only started off with a project of doing 10. Now we're doing blocks of 10, and it's very rewarding. But yeah, lots changed in 82. We set out to find out more about some things that are just not being covered on the mainstream media, and we're still doing that. But it's a real privilege to talk to these people, to in many cases get their work, their books sent on to us as PDFs or hard copies. Get a chance to talk with these people, and it really is. It's really been a great 2 years so far. Future Science is the name of the book that I'm holding in my hand here. Future Science, Forbidden Science of the 21st Century, and it tells me on the back, Future Science solves the 12 great mysteries of physics, including how gravity works. It explains how gravity waves can be used to provide unlimited supplies of free energy, and how anti-gravity waves can be used to cause the molecular disintegration of matter to produce unlimited supplies of free hydrogen to power cars of the future. In the second part of the book, the author journeys back to the beginning of time to reveal the long-lost science of God, which explains how the universe began, the purpose of life, and the secrets of heaven, hell, and purgatory. That is a tall order, but the author succeeds, I think, because I thoroughly enjoyed this book, Future Science, by Maurice Cottrell, and this gentleman is the guest on this week's Irish Side of the Moon. Enjoy. And I'm on the line now with Maurice Cottrell. It's a pleasure to speak to you today. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you, Michael.
Pleasure to have you on the Irish Side of the Moon. We're here primarily, I suppose, to talk about Future Science, which I have here beside me. I read it last weekend, and very eager to talk to you about that and the various things that you cover. You cover a lot in that as well, worth reading. But before we get to Future Science, we always like to talk to our guests a little bit about themselves and their formative years, as it were. What got them down the path that they're on at the moment. So I would like you, if you could just roll the clock back for me, back to your teenage years. What was captivating your interest? What sort of things? Were you looking at scientific things? Were you looking at engineering? Or were you just, typical teenager, were you having fun? What were the things that set you down this particular path?
Okay, Michael. Well, my journey began in about 1971. I left Naval College, where I was studying electrical and communications engineering, and I went to sea as a radio officer on board ship. So that involved a great deal of travel and, of course, communications, mainly via shortwave. And what I noticed was, when I was sailing from north to south, was that I discovered something which was very interesting, and that was the behavior of the crew primarily changed from depending on which way the ship went. From north to south, they were quite relaxed and happy. When we changed course from east to west over long periods of days, several days, then they became very agitated. And also at the same time, it was difficult to communicate to London from places as far afield as South Africa. And I became very interested in whether or not the sun's radiation, the sunspot cycle, could be having any effect on the behavior of the crew. So I really started to get very interested in astrology, how the planets and the stars and so on could affect behavior. And on that very first trip, I actually went to the Far East, to China, and I was introduced there to the 12-year astrological cycle, where that goes back to the days of Buddha, which legend has it, Buddha was calling all of the animals in the kingdom to say goodbye to them, and they all arrived one by one. First of all, the rat, then it was followed by the ox, the cat, the tiger, the dragon, the snake, and so on. So the Chinese have 12 years named after 12 animals, and in the West we have 12 months named after 12 signs in the sky, 12 astronomical phenomena, star patterns in the sky. So I decided to see if there was any connection between the 11.5-year sunspot cycle and the 12-year cycle of the Chinese. And then I tried to see if the sun could in any way be responsible for astrology as we knew it over the 12 months. And as I started to do my investigations, I started to monitor the behavior of the crew, I satisfied myself that astrology did in fact work. So I set my heart on finding out how it worked, and basically trying to answer several questions that science couldn't answer, and not only couldn't they answer, but they were very skeptical about, and refused to even look into things like astrology, which of course goes back thousands of years.
Yes, of course, it's kind of official orthodox science would look down on it. And that's interesting because that you started from there, because one small section of future science which really leaped out at me, and I did want to talk about it anyway, is the very fact that, you know, from your work you can scientifically explain astrology. And I found that, as I say, it's only a small portion, but it did leap out at me, and I know that. So it's interesting that that was the impetus that got you started, because we're still back in the 1970s. You observed something, you investigated, and you started to find parallels. And
absolutely.
And at that stage, was there very much done? When you were investigating, was there anything, or scientific, modern 20th century as it was science, that could help you, or did you just have to go back to the ancient knowledge?
No, it wasn't just the ancient knowledge. At that time, in fact, I hadn't really discovered the ancient knowledge of the ancient sun-worshipping civilizations. But I suppose I was fortunate in a way, because discoveries were being made around that time. For example, in 1958, that's when I was a boy, clearly, Explorer 1 spacecraft discovered the Van Allen belts that encircle the Earth. And these belts of radiation are above the Earth. The first belt's about 3,000 miles away. The second belt's about 15,000 miles away. And we know now that the sun radiates particles, electrons and protons. Those particles travel to the Earth in the solar wind. Fortunately, they're captured by the Van Allen belts. But they go from North Pole to South Pole of the Van Allen belts, north to south, every 1 second. And as they do, the geomagnetic field on Earth changes. And again, that was a discovery made in 1979 by a professor called Ian Nicholson, who used to be lecturing at Newcastle Polytechnic in those days. And basically what he discovered was that variations in the solar wind produce changes in the Earth's magnetosphere, that's the Earth's magnetic shroud, that are reflected in the terrestrial magnetic field at ground level. And then as the space probes began to get more and more information about the sun, I started to understand the mechanism, which I now understand fully. And basically, now we know what's happening is that the sun actually spins on its axis every 28 days when viewed from Earth. As it spins, it showers off particles, which we call the solar wind. Those particle winds flow towards the Earth, get captured in the Van Allen belts. The magnetic field changes at ground level, and in 1986, a group of scientists in the USA, in Maryland, discovered that test tube baby experiments were being changed by the magnetic fields from the overhead lighting. And once we realized that magnetism can change the DNA by shuffling up the DNA in the actual sample of the baby, if you like, then we have a mutational force. In other words, the sun has 12 different types of mutation every year. The 12 types of radiation comes off the sun. That results in 12 types of magnetic fields being produced by the Van Allen belts, and that magnetic field results in 12 types of personality in the developing fetus on Earth. So this explained how astrology works. It's very straightforward and very simple once you take all of the factors that we now know into consideration. So once I discovered that, I began to understand that the 28-day spinning sun also affects the production of estrogen and progesterone in the female brain.
Yeah.
And this is why females menstruate every 28 days. And this began to explain now why the ancient sun-worshipping civilizations like the Mayas of Mexico, Tutankhamun of Egypt, the Celtic people, the ancient Chinese of the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, the Viracochas of Peru and the pyramids of Peru, why all of these people worship the sun as the god of astrology and also the god of fertility, because it does regulate fertility. As the sun spins, it showers particles towards the earth, the amount of estrogen and progesterone in females changes, and of course fertility on earth varies as a result.
And you mentioned in the book as well, there's the lady who was underground for 4 months. She thought she was underground for 2 months. Tell us that story.
Yes, this was an article that appeared in Nature magazine. I think it was about 1979. Her name was Stephanie Follini. And it was an experiment undertaken by NASA in New Mexico. And they put her underground, and her biorhythms changed, which, of course, is what you'd expect, because her brain is being modulated or not being modulated anymore because she's underground by the magnetic field of the sun. What this means is, normally, our brains are subject to an emotional biorhythm every 7 days as the sun spins. So we get 7 days positive, 7 days negative, 7 days positive, 7 days negative over a 28-day cycle. Now, if you put somebody underground, you shield them from that cycle, so their biorhythms lose synchronization with the solar clock. She thought she'd spent 2 months underground, when in fact she'd spent 4 months underground, and her menstrual cycle stopped. Now, this is very interesting scientifically, because what it means is if you put females underground, they cannot replicate. They're infertile because the sun's radiation is making them fertile. And if it works that way for females, does it work that way for chickens? Does it work that way for frogs? Does it work that way for slugs? Does it work that way for bacteria? Does it work that way for a virus? Does it mean that if we put people suffering from AIDS underground, that the virus would not be able to replicate? And if we brought them away from being underground back onto the surface, the virus would have become extinct because it couldn't replicate during the period it was underground. So this whole window of astrology presents us with information which affects science in a completely different way than we may have expected. It's now bringing us into the realms of fertility and medicine and physics, of course. And
agreed. And I mean, you touch on this, and it does. It's amazing that something, again, it has far-reaching consequences, and we'll come back to it again because so many things are fascinating. Bringing the story back briefly to yourself again, so you're on your own journey and you observed something, you investigated it, you found all this knowledge, and again, it's obvious from reading your work, from listening to you, you've decades worth of information building done. Tell me now about the leap from merely being curious and researching to actually putting your own work out there. Your first book, that journey, that section, that's interesting to us. How did that come about, and what were you trying to achieve when you started making your own footprint in the sand, as it were?
In 1989, I was working at Cranfield University in the Midlands, and I actually worked for the campus management of the university. My job was electrical and communications engineer for the entire university. So I looked after all of the high voltage, low voltage, all the communications, all the internet, all the broadband, not the internet, the broadband at the time, the campus-wide broadband system, and so on. And I had after discovering how the sunspot cycle was operating, the mechanics of it, I found a way of calculating the sunspot cycle. I asked the guys in the computer center to write me a program, of course they call it an algorithm, to actually mathematically ascertain the duration of the cycles of the sun's magnetic cycles. So whilst I was at Cranfield, I had access to the computer, and I put the variables that I was interested in, that is the solar variables and the variable of the Earth moving around the sun. And I asked the computer to do me a computer printout of the behavior, the magnetic behavior of the solar variables and the Earth. And I came out with 3 cycles, 2 fundamental cycles. One was 11.4929 years, and one was 187 years. And what the computer plot showed me was these 2 cycles mixed together over an 18,139-year cycle. And during that 18,000-year cycle, the magnetic field of the sun changes 5 times. Now, the ancient civilization of the Maya believed that there was a long cosmic cycle, during which time the magnetic field of the sun changed 5 times, and that this caused catastrophe on Earth 5 times during that period. So I became very interested in ancient sun-worshipping civilizations. And I went down to Mexico to the ceremonial center of Palenque. Now, this would be about 1991. And I looked at the pyramids of Palenque, and one in particular, which was the Temple of Inscriptions and the Pyramid of Inscriptions, which was the burial place of the leader of the Maya, Lord Paykal. Now, Lord Paykal was, if we listen to what the Maya tell us about him, was a very special guy. For example, he performed miracles. They say that when he was born through an immaculate conception. And when he died, they say he became the planet Venus, the purest and brightest source of light in the heavens. So I went down and I had a look at the pyramid, but with a different eye this time. I was looking at how they knew the sun affected fertility, how they knew the sun caused differentiation of personality, 12 different star signs of the zodiac. And once I started to look at the artifacts that they left behind in a different light, I realized that they worshipped a number, and that number was 1,366,040 days. That was from the computer printout at Cranfield. That was one of the magnetic reversal periods. And that was a number worshipped by the Maya in Central America 1,250 years ago. Now, it took me 2 years to figure that out, using one of the biggest computers in the UK at the time. And the Maya clearly understood this period and the cyclical activity on the sun 1,200 years ago before me. So I was dealing with a very advanced civilization here, at least I thought so. And I started to decode the treasures of the Maya. And I made terrific progress, and I put all the work together into a best-selling book, which was become a best-selling book, called The Maya Prophecies. That was in 1995.
Right, and that's what got you started on the road as an author, as it were. Yes, right, okay, I'm with you.
Exactly. Now, I took, of course, the publishing route is never an easy one, and I think most authors will describe difficulties they have with publishers. I had a particularly hard time at that time with that book. And I took my book to the publishers at the time in 1993. And of course, they mess you around for a couple of years. This is how publishers operate. They soften up the author for a couple of years. It brings the price down, and then they get what they want. But then not only that, after a couple of years, we're getting to 1994 now, 1995, they said, well, we want to jazz up the book and make it more popular, so we want somebody to rewrite it. So I said, well, I'd rather not go down that road. So they said, well, that's the only way we're going to do it. So I had to agree to it. And what happened then was, what I discovered was that the Maya knew that the sun's magnetic field would reverse in the year 700 AD, when they were at the top of their civilization. And what I discovered is that the sun showers particles towards the Earth. That causes changes in the Earth's magnetic field. That affects biorhythms. It affects fertility on Earth. The sunspot cycle is caused by the movement of the magnetic fields on the sun, which move at different rates. And I put all of this into the book, showing that the Maya disappeared in AD 700 because of these magnetic reversals. We had a sunspot minimum. There were fewer spots on the surface of the sun. And that resulted in lower temperatures on Earth at that time. That resulted in less evaporation of the water from the oceans, which meant we had less rainfall, which resulted in drought. At the same time, I showed that when we have a sunspot minimum, we have more X-rays bombard the equatorial regions of the Earth. That causes spontaneous fetal abortion and miscarriages. So the Maya, they not only had a drought, but they had and a famine, but they had fewer babies, and they also had less radiation to inspire fertility in females. So they had less babies anyway. So the Maya had a triple whammy, and that's what finished them off, basically. So there are very few Mayas left after 750 AD. Now, the publishers wanted me to say in the book that A, they wanted me to say two things. A, the Mayan calendar ends in 2012, and B, the reason the Mayan calendar ends in 2012 is because the sun's magnetic fields are going to bring catastrophic destruction to planet Earth. I said, well, I can't say that because that's not what happens. All I can say is that the Mayas calculated it would finish them off in AD 700, and it did. Now, they tried to sensationalize the book, and they didn't need to because one of my biggest fans was Lord Rothermere, who owned the Daily Mail. And when the book was published, Lord Rothermere arranged for 17 full pages to appear in the Daily Mail of the book. So the book got to the Sunday Times top 10 list, and it sold a lot of copies in the UK and overseas. And, of course, the publishers, being dishonest as they were, they went bust anyway because the book was so successful they couldn't print enough, and not only did they go bust, but they took 3 printers with them at the time. So the start of publishing wasn't a particularly easy route to follow, but after I got rid of those publishers, I addressed the question of how could this ancient civilization have been aware of this knowledge? And I wrote a book after that in 1997 called The Super Gods, and this was with the different publishers, HarperCollins. And basically, I began to realize that I'd made a mistake in looking at the Mayas of Central America and imagining them to be very clever. And the mistake I'd made was a very simple one. It was like saying that 2,000 years ago in Judea, all of the Judeans could walk on the water, that they could all turn water into wine, and that they could all heal the sick with their bare hands. And then I realized, well, of course, there's a little bit of truth in that, but it wasn't everybody in Judea. It was one man in Judea. His name was Jesus. And in fact, in Ireland, they refer to Jesus as Pascal because Jesus was crucified at the time of the Passover. And Passover in Hebrew is the word Pasak. So in Ireland, or in the Roman Catholic faith, the word Pascal refers to Easter. Now, of course, the leader of the Maya was called Lord Pacal, very similar. And they say that Lord Pacal was born in a stable, that when he grew up he performed miracles, and when he died he became Venus, the brightest planet in the heavens. Now, the last page of the Bible, Jesus says, I, Jesus, the son of David, am the bright and morning star. Now, the bright and morning star is the planet Venus. And it's called that because sometimes Venus, when we look at it in the sky, it's very close to the sun. Sometimes Venus is on the left-hand side of the sun. And sometimes, 292 days later, it's on the right-hand side of the sun. What that means is that if Venus is on the left-hand side of the sun, when the sun rises and lights up the sky, we can't see Venus, which is to the left of the sun, because the sky is bright. The only time we see Venus is in the evening when the sun sets, leaving Venus behind in a dark sky. So then it's called the evening star. When the Venus is on the right-hand side of the sun, we can't see it in the evening, we can only see it in the morning, and that's when it's called the morning star. So we get the morning star and the evening star. And when we put these two, of course it's a planet, Venus is a planet, but we refer to it as a star because it is a source of light. Now, if you get these two, the circle represents Venus in the morning and the circle Venus in the evening, and we bring them together to overlap, then we get a crescent shape on either side as they intersect, and that's called the Vesica Pisces of the fish, and that's the geometric symbol of Christianity. And the reason it represents Christianity is because when Jesus was born 2,000 years ago, the constellation in the sky overhead was Pisces, the sign of the fish. More than 2,000 years later, we're now moving into the age of Aquarius, which is the water carrier. But at the time, it was a sign of the fish, the sign of Pisces. And the mistake I realized I'd made, looking at the Maya, was to imagine that all of the Maya could perform miracles. But of course, it wasn't like that. Lord Pacal was a miracle maker like Jesus. And when we start to decode all of the treasures of Lord Pacal, he tells us he was born before as Tutankhamun, the son of God, Tutankhamun. So I went down. After that, after 1997, I went down to Egypt and I looked at the tomb of Tutankhamun. And Tutankhamun leaves the same messages behind as Lord Paykal. And in Tutankhamun's tomb and Lord Paykal's tomb in Mexico, they told me, or gave me information, that I had to go down to Peru and have a look at the tombs of the Viracochas in the pyramids of Peru. Now, the pyramids of Peru are on the coast of Peru in the northwest of the country. And in 1989, tombs were found in a complex of two buried lords or priest kings that the archaeologists refer to as the Lord of Saipan, Saipan being the village, and the old Lord of Saipan, the Lord who was born before the second one, the young Lord, if you like. And I started to decode all the treasures from their tombs. And then I realized that Lord Paykal was a reincarnation of Tutankhamun and of the Viracochas of Peru. The old Lord of Peru was actually called Viracocha Pachacamac, and legends tell us how he walked the lands of Peru, performing miracles, healing the sick with his bare hands in around AD 500. And of course, Viracocha from AD 350, it means foam of the sea. And the reason it, in the language of the in the language of the Quechua of Peru. Now, the reason why they called this miracle maker the foam of the sea is because we are perfect when we are in the foam of the sea. And the reason we're perfect is because we're in contact with all of the elements of earth, air, fire, and water. We have the earth beneath our feet, the sun in our face, the wind in our hair, and the water lapping over our feet. So we're perfect. We're in contact with all four elements. If we move from the foam of the sea onto the beach, we lose contact with the water. If we move into the water away from the beach, we lose contact with the earth. So the only time a man is perfect is in the foam of the sea. And this is why the ancient Hindu worship the cow as the giver of the milk, because heaven for the Hindu is a milky ocean. They refer to heaven as a milky ocean, and that's why the cow is sacred, because the cow gives milk, so they don't kill the cow. They worship it and garland it with flowers and so on. Mm-hmm. So these two white gods who walked the lands of Peru in olden times, Viracocha and Viracocha Pachacamac, that was Viracocha, foam of the sea, the crab man, and Viracocha Pachacamac, the god of the world, they called him. All of these pictures you can find in the decoded tomb treasures of Lord Paykal and Tutankhamun, and also in the legends of Buddha and Krishna of the Hindu. And of course, Krishna means Christ, the Christos, the enlightened one, and the anointed one. And once I made this connection between all of these ancient gods, and also with Qin Shi Huangdi in China, the first emperor of unified China. Now, his name means the son of heaven. And once you bring all of these this information from these ancient tombs together, you begin to realize that this is the same spiritual energy that keeps coming back to earth periodically. Now, in the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu Bible, or holy book, Krishna says, whenever irreligion takes over the earth, I reincarnate myself. And so what's happening here is every time irreligion takes over the earth, a spiritual leader comes down from heaven, and it's the same spiritual leader which brings the same information to mankind, who tells us why we are born, why we die, why we have to live at all. He explains what heaven is and what hell is. And all of these pictures that I'm telling you about now, these secret encoded pictures left behind by these ancient civilizations, explain why we're born, why we die, why this has to be, what God is, what the devil is, what heaven is, what time is, why the world began, how the world began. It goes into very high levels of physics, how gravity works, electricity, magnetism. And this is why I was able to decode all of this information and then apply it to physics to figure out how gravity works.
Yes, now, I'm going to interrupt you for a second, because that brings us perfectly on to what I want to ask you next. Anyway, let's just take a quick overview. So we've had the situation where you observed something firsthand back in the 70s. You did research. It set you on a path. You brought us right up to date, the 1990s. Publishers being scummy, trying to turn a book to make it sexy. But you started your books, you got one to the next, and there's a logical progression. As you investigated one thing, it led you to the next thing. So far we've talked mostly, we've probably covered about half of the book Future Science. The third and fourth sections, we've talked about those. I want to look at this is perfectly what I want to talk about next. I wanted to ask you about the opening and what led you. You're about to tell me. Because you start off Future Science talking about gravity. You start off explaining gravity in a new way. And then, which is also very interesting, you talk about energy. The idea that we could use that knowledge to generate power, etc. So tell us how that leap came about and what led you to what opens the book, Gravity, and I know you've written about this before, but tell us about it.
When I started to figure out what the Mayas were talking about and the spiritual side of life and how mankind is essentially electromagnetic energy, a spirit, if you like, a being with a soul and a biological body, that there are two sides to life, a mirror image, if you like, the soul and the body, like the left hand and the right hand. They're mirror images of each other. And once I began to understand how the Maya explained life and why we were here, I was able to look at life in a different way. For example, I realized that intelligence wasn't a function of intellectual processing within the brain. For example, if you looked at a swallow flying through the branches of a tree at 100 miles an hour, it wasn't because the swallow was intelligent or clever, because the swallow has a brain the size of a pea. So whatever enables the swallow to fly with such dexterity and at such speeds had nothing to do with the swallow. In other words, it had nothing to do with the body of the swallow. What that meant was that it must be something to do with the soul of the swallow, and the soul is God, godly energy, electromagnetic energy. And I say that because in the Bible it says God is light. Or it said in the Bible it actually says God said, let there be light. In the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was God, and God said, let there be light, and behold, there was light. In the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu book, it says God is light. It's quite specific. And light, we understand today, in today's terms, is electromagnetic energy. Electromagnetic energy is voltage. So what that means is that every living thing has a voltage inside it driving it, like a battery, if you like. Now, when we're a fetus in the womb and the cells come together, the cells of the sperm and the cell of the sperm and the cells in the fetus, in the ovum, they exchange their chemicals, their DNA and so on, and they start to generate electrical voltages as the cells begin to develop and get larger and larger. And those tiny voltages then become into larger voltages as the systems begin to grow and develop, the nervous systems and so on. Now, if we look at Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared, what that tells us is energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. And what that means is if, because we know that God is voltage, then in the beginning, if energy equals mass times the speed of light squared, then if God existed in the beginning, then God's energy must have created the physical universe that we see ourselves in today. And I'm slightly digressing here, Michael, because I'm still in the second part of the book, but hopefully it will take me into the first part of the book.
Okay, work at your own pace, because it's every bit of it is fascinating. So no, it's okay. I'll bring you back to it later. Continue.
Okay. Continue. No, I'll go on to it. But yeah. What I'm saying is the swallow's brain cannot be the source of the intelligence which is driving the swallow. Now, when I plug my computer into the socket, it comes alive. And when I unplug my computer from the electrical socket, it dies. And the same thing's happening with human beings and every other living thing. As long as we've got God inside us, then we're alive. And the energy animates us. The electrical energy from my brain makes my muscles move, which lifts my arms up and down like a puppet, my legs up and down, and I can smile and I can eat and I can walk and I can talk. It animates me. But if my body ever becomes sick and the godly voltage is released, then my body is dead, like the unplugged computer. Now, once I realized how the soul and the body worked from the teachings of the Maya, and how the swallow found its way through the branches of a tree at 100 miles an hour, I then decided that intelligence has nothing to do with discovery. Okay, so that means if I wanted to ask any question in the world, it's got nothing to do with intelligence. So I decided to put this to the test, and on January the 1st in 2007, I decided that I would try to find out how gravity worked, given that it has nothing to do with intelligence. And given that intelligent people have tried to discover it before and failed, which supports the fact that I believe that discovery has nothing to do with intelligence. It's God. If I give God the problem, then he'll allow me to discover gravity. And this is what happens. If you go to bed with a question and sleep on it, you'll wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning with the answer. That's because God will tell you the answer while you sleep. You don't have to figure it out. God will always figure it out for you, because God is the electromagnetic energy inside you. So within 6 weeks in 2007, I figured out how gravity worked. And then it took me 3 years to find a way of explaining it to people in a way that people could understand. And that's why it takes up the first half of the book in Future Science. Now, when I started...
I'll tell you what we do. We'll actually break there. We always take a break around this stage. We're going to take a short break here on the Irish Side of the Moon. We're coming right back for the rest of this conversation. Stay with us.
You're listening to The Irish Side of the Moon. You can hear our new episodes every Monday on radiomedia.org and irishsideofthemoon.blogspot.com. You can also download episodes from iTunes, Stitcher, and many other sites. You can follow us on Twitter, you can join our Facebook group, and if you're already in the group, don't forget to invite your friends. If you have any ideas for future guests on the show, send an email to shane@theirishsideofthemoon.ie. We are Irish Side of the Moon. Freedom of information, personal empowerment.
Okay, you're back on the Irish Side of the Moon. I'm talking to Maurice Cotterill. We're going to talk about the book Future Science. We're on the way to that. You were in full flight there before the break. Gravity. You basically just handed the problem, as it were, over to God. Agreeing, deciding, observing, because you really are a detective. You observe constantly. It's all observation. Observation, deduction. Observation, deduction. So yes, intelligence wasn't required. You took the leap and you came up with your explanation for gravity. Continue, please.
What I had to do then, Michael, was I had to look at, clearly, gravity. Isaac Newton's definition of gravity is the force that attracts two particles together. So I started to analyze the actual definition of gravity first, because I didn't want to take it for granted. I think a lot of people come across Newton's equation and they say, well, gravity is the force of attraction between two particles, or two bodies, he actually said. So I thought, well, nobody else has figured out gravity, so maybe Newton was wrong. First of all, I've got to challenge what Newton says. I've got to challenge every single step of the way if I'm going to find out what's actually going on, if I'm to succeed where other people have failed. So I started at the beginning and thought, well, why did Newton say it's not between one body and nothing? And could it be between one body and nothing? In other words, when the first particle appeared in the universe, was there any gravity? And I sat and I thought about that for a few days. And then I thought, well, let's now introduce the second particle. Let's say the second particle arrived a millionth of a second after the first. Newton says we must have gravity because we've got two particles. Therefore, there's a force of attraction between the two. So therefore, what happened between the interval between when the first body appeared and the second body appeared? So clearly, something must have traveled from atom number 1 to atom number 2 to attract it, and something must have happened from atom number 2 to attract atom number 1. So I thought, well, there's only two things that can cause something to be attracted. Either the atoms must be sending energy out to each other, or they must be sending out bits of matter, because there are only two things in the universe, energy and matter. So something has caused that attraction between the two, either energy or matter. If it was matter, then that would mean that the atoms are disintegrating and throwing out bits of themselves like bullets. Well, we know that doesn't happen because otherwise everything would shrink around us. So we know that's not what's happening. So therefore, the atoms must be giving off some kind of energy which is traveling towards each other. And the only energy that travels through space, as far as we know, is electromagnetic energy. And electromagnetic energy is made up of an electric wave and a magnetic wave, where the electric wave goes up and down and the magnetic wave goes from side to side. Now, with that in mind, we can't see how gravity could work. So I put that to one side and I thought, okay, let's have a look at the matter itself. Could there be something wrong with the actual understanding of the atom? And I was quite amazed when I started to look into the atom and atomic theory. And I realized that physicists know absolutely nothing. So I started to look at the atom, and physicists say that an atom is comprised of positive charges in the middle of the atom, which they call the center of the nucleus, and that's orbited by negative particles. And there are as many negatives as there are positives, so it's balanced. Now, there are a couple of problems with that. If the center of the atom is made of positive charges, why don't the charges spring apart? After all, positive repels positive. Now, this is where we discover where modern physics went wrong, and it was in about 1925. A researcher called Yukawa in Japan suggested, well, look, we appreciate that positive repels positive, but maybe when we had the Big Bang, the explosion, they were thrown together with so much force that they got glued together. You know, maybe they're covered in a sort of glue like Velcro, you know, where you've got like a hook side and a velvet side. And when they were thrown together, although they'd like to split, Velcro is holding them together. And that's why the middle of the atom doesn't spring apart. Well, another researcher came along and he said, well, that's all very well, but if you've got a hook side and a velvet side, what happens when you get a few of the hook sides next to each other in the middle? And what happens if you get a few of the velvet sides sitting next to each other? The velvet won't stick to the velvet, so they should spring apart, and the hooks wouldn't stick to the hooks, so they should spring apart. So another researcher came along and he said, well, there must be 3 types of Velcro. That way, you know, the chances are they'd all stick together. But then another guy came along. He said, well, actually, you know, that wouldn't work either. You'd need 3 types of each of the 3 types to stick together. And now they're looking for more than 300 different types of glue, and they've never found any of it. In fact, the Oxford Science Dictionary says this: the whole elaborate theory is circumstantial. None of the smaller particles have ever been identified in experiments. The theory does not claim to have been verified. So what we find is scientists haven't got a clue why the middle of the atom doesn't spring apart.
But of course, as you comment, they're making a lot of money. There's money being thrown at this search. It's not just a search.
Of course, they get billions of dollars every year to find gravity. So, of course, they're not going to find it. If they found it, they'd be out of work and on the dole. So, of course, they're not going to find it. They're going to spend their lifetimes looking for it. There's no incentive for them to find it. If we take the orbiting electrons, which are negative, why don't the negatives get sucked into the middle? Because positive attracts negative. They don't know. Why do electrons orbit the atom in 8 different shells? They don't know. Why are the shells offset by at least 45 degrees? They don't know. How does gravity work? They don't know. How does magnetism work? They don't know. It seems to work by magic, so they call them magnets. Simple as that. How does a battery work? They don't know. How does electricity work? They don't know. Why, when an electrical current flows, do we get a magnetic field around the wire? They don't know. Why is it 90 degrees to the wire? They don't know. Why do stars cluster? You know, why do they cluster in bunches in the sky? They don't know. Oh, they say there might be more planets out there that we can't see, and the gravity from those planets and stars holds them together. But they said we can't see any. So they said, well, that's all right. Let's call it dark matter because we can't see it. Why are stars spiral? Why do they have a double spiral, the galaxy formations? They don't know. What drives the sunspot cycle? They don't know. What causes global warming and global cooling? They don't know. Future science explains all of these questions, every single one of them. It explains why the atom's stable, how gravity works, why electrons occupy the shells they do, why the shells are offset by 45 degrees at least, as they are, how electricity works, why magnetism appears around a wire with electricity, why the stars take the formations they do, what drives the sunspot cycle. All of those questions are answered, including gravity, which is very, very simple.
Yeah, and that's one thing about the book, because when I opened it first and I saw all the diagrams and I realized, you know, the sort of scientific stuff that was going to be there, I assumed it would be a heavy read, but it's actually not.
No, it's very simple.
Yeah, and although you cover so much material, it kind of flows organically, because it kind of goes from A to B to C to D, and as the reader is swept along, it kind of makes sense, you know, to me anyway. It's kind of, it flowed and you cover a lot. Talk to me about energy, the idea of being able to use the knowledge of gravity with regard to generation.
When we understand how gravity waves work, we can begin to generate gravity waves. And I absolutely know that what I'm proposing about how gravity works is valid, is efficacious, if you like, is because a couple of scientists in Vienna in 2007 filed a patent for a gravity wave generator. Now, they'd stumbled upon this just by chance. They'd set up some apparatus in their laboratory, and they were trying to measure the gravitational field and changes in the gravitational field. And by chance, they noticed that the gravitational field was changing certain times during the day. And eventually, they realized that when the guy downstairs went for lunch and went for a tea break, the gravity field changed in their laboratory. What they found was, when they started to investigate it, was that the CD-ROM in his computer, every time he switched it on and switched it off, it affected the gravitational field in the laboratory above.
It's amazing,
so,
isn't it?
It is, yeah. Amazing. So they started to do experiments with CD-ROMs, playing around with them. And they, at one stage, they knew it was a CD-ROM, and then they knew it was gravity waves. They knew that because they put it in a glass case. It couldn't have been air motion or anything like that, or light even. They make sure it was a proper scientific... And these are two most senior physicists in Europe. They work for the European Space Agency in Vienna. Okay? These are not just two guys having a joke in a laboratory. Now, they came up with a design at the end of the day where they had a disc, and they drew a cross on the disc so they could get 4 points on the edge of the disc. And on each point, they put a bar magnet that was spinning on the edge of the disc. So it was like a propeller at right angles to the disc. So we had 4 propellers. Then they started the disc spinning. And what was happening is, this disc, I know how it's working because I've shown it in the book. I've proven it in the book. But they didn't know how it worked. But it worked because they could affect the gravity of things about the machine. So they invented this gravity wave generator, and they filed for a patent application with the International Patent Office. But they were denied the patent, not because it didn't work. The patent officer says it does seem to have an effect, but we don't know how it works because we don't know if it's gravity, because nobody knows how gravity works. So it could be some other force that nobody's ever thought of yet. So their patent was denied. But what it meant was all of their experimental work proves that my hypothesis on how gravity has to work must be correct. Now, once we understand that gravity waves aren't right-angled waves that we spoke of earlier when we mentioned that radio waves have an electric wave and a magnetic wave, so does a gravity wave. The difference is, with a radio wave, the electric wave is vertical and the magnetic wave is horizontal. With a gravity wave, it's not like that. It's like a corkscrew. It's a corkscrew wave. So if you imagine you've got a magnetic and electrical wave, but instead of being at right angles, they form a screw pattern. And what that means is it's like the Archimedes screw pump in the water. Archimedes, if you remember, was born about 287 BC, and he invented the first water pump, whereby he had a log which had a screw thread on it inside a tube. And he put this log into the river and turned the handle on the tube so that the log rotated inside the cylinder, and the water is sucked up the screw thread onto the riverbank, which allowed them to irrigate the fields. And this, in an analogous kind of way, is how gravity works. Every hydrogen atom, and hydrogen accounts for 93% of all the matter in the universe, every hydrogen atom radiates corkscrew-style radio waves. These radio waves have several effects on the atoms around them. More complex atoms, for example, behave differently to hydrogen. Hydrogen is very simple. You've got one positive charge in the middle and one negative charge going around it, like the moon goes around the Earth. Like the Earth goes around the sun. That's a better analogy.
Okay, yep.
Now, other atoms are not like that. Other atoms have multiple electrons and multiple protons in the middle. And because the shells of the atom are offset by more than 45 degrees, as the electrons orbit the atom, more complex atoms, the electrons bunch up in certain positions. So the atom flops from left to right, from up to down, from front to back. It doesn't spin like the hydrogen atom. The hydrogen atom spins. As it spins, it produces corkscrew-style waves, which radiate from the atom, from the North Pole and from the South Pole. So it's got two waves coming out of each end of the atom. Other atoms don't radiate gravity waves. So then, of course, we ask the question, well, how can other atoms be attracted to other atoms if the bigger atoms aren't involved in the gravitational mechanism? Well, what happens is the corkscrew radiation from the hydrogen atoms causes neighboring atoms to spin in the same direction. So they stop flopping about, tumbling about. They stop going from left to right, from up to down, and they start to spin coherently as soon as they're bombarded by corkscrew energy from a hydrogen atom. What that means is that the more complex atoms start to spin in the same direction. So the hydrogen atom is sucked towards a more complex atom, and the more complex atom is then sucked towards other atoms in alignment. And this is how gravity works. It's very straightforward. Once we understand how gravity works, then we can understand how to generate gravity waves, because we don't need a machine like the two guys in Vienna, the two physicists. They invented a machine. Once we know that water, hydrogen, produces gravity waves, then all we have to do is line up all of the elements in the periodic table. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, there are certain substances on the Earth, materials, which are basic. You can't get any more fundamental. You can mix them with other things, but you can't mix anything together to form the elementary ones. They're basic and pure in their unmixed state. Now, because of the way the atom is formed, and because of the way the atom builds when it's being created, there are only a maximum of 120 different elements. And that means there are atoms with 120 electrons, 120 protons, and 120 neutrons. That's the biggest atom you can get. Every other atom has a different number. For example, carbon has 6 electrons, 6 protons, 6 neutrons. Oxygen has 8 electrons, 8 protons, 8 neutrons, and so on. Different materials have different numbers of electrons and protons. And this was discovered just after Rutherford was doing his experiments in the UK in the 20s. Once we understand how, you see, just let me digress slightly. Yeah. For example, most people think that when the moon comes overhead, the moon pulls on the oceans and we get high tides. But that's not what's happening. Once you understand that the oceans give off masses and masses of gravity rays, then look at it another way. Picture a Keep Fit enthusiast doing press-ups underneath his doorway. He grabs hold of the doorway on top of him, the lintel over his head, and he pulls himself towards the ceiling using the strength in his arms. Now, he can do that because the door frame is above him. But if he went into the center of the room, he couldn't pull himself up to the ceiling because there is no doorway above his head. Mm-hmm. Now, it's the same way with the moon. The gravity radiation coming off the oceans radiates from the Earth, all over the Earth. But because there's nothing to grab hold of, the oceans are not attracted to anything. When the moon appears overhead, the gravity radiation from the oceans grabs onto the moon, and the oceans pull themselves towards the moon. You see the difference? It's the other way around. Yeah. And once we start to look at physics and how everything's working, what we find is everything's the other way around. And what we thought was true is actually false.
Okay. 2 questions. First one, when you published your work, when you published your hypothesis, the reaction, was it embraced with open arms?
Well, of course not, no, because I sent it to, first of all, I sent it to the Institute for Engineering and Technology, of which I'm a member. And they politely wrote back and said, it's very interesting, but we really can't get involved in gravity. It's a matter for the Institute of Physics. So I wrote to the Institute of Physics in London. They didn't write back. 2 months later, I wrote again and said, look, the Institute of Engineering and Technology suggested I contact you with these discoveries. What do you think? Eventually, they wrote back and said, we do not talk about new discoveries. However, you might want to contact our subsidiary company, Institute of Physics Publishing Limited in Bristol. So I said, okay, I contacted them. And I looked at the submission requirements on the internet and for the duplicate copies and the layout and so on. And I produced them two copies of my paper, How Gravity Works, which is on my website, by the way, for free. You can download it for free, www.mauricecotterill.com. Yes. Now, I sent it to them. They wrote back within 20 hours. So they'd obviously been talking about it together. Within 20 hours, they wrote back and they said, we're not going to publish it for 3 reasons. The first one is, it's completely new. The second reason was, there's nothing in it that we have been working on. And the third one was, it doesn't have any mathematics in it. And don't contact us again.
I'm laughing because you used those as the blurbs on the back of Future Science. And when I was reading the book, I was like, when I got to that section, I was like, hold on, that's where the blurbs came from.
That's right, yeah, exactly, on the back of the book.
Yeah, it contains no mathematics. It is completely new. And, These are all reasons why it should be looked at. Of course.
Because it is new, because it doesn't contain mathematics, because it isn't keeping an army of mathematicians and 40,000 physicists in a job for life. They don't want to accept how gravity works. They don't want to know why things fall to the floor when you drop them. They want to stay in their primitive state forever. So I thought, well, that's not a problem. I'll get on with the book. I'll write the book, which I've got to do anyway. And it makes no difference to me if they want to accept it or not. And then as I started to work on the book and look at, I then had to get into, once I got into gravity waves, I discovered that to create gravity waves, all you have to do is put a can of water, which contains hydrogen, and of course oxygen, H2O, in front of a can of helium, in front of a can of lithium, in front of a can of beryllium, and in front of 120 different cans filled with 120 different elements of the periodic table. And once I'd done that, that's all I had to do. Just line up these 120 containers. How does it work? The hydrogen atoms give off corkscrew radiation. They cause the helium atoms to spin in the same direction. The helium atoms suck in heat from the room, or from ambient heat. They convert the heat into corkscrew radiation, and that corkscrew radiation bombards the next can in line, the lithium. The lithium atoms sucks in heat. That then converts the heat into gravity rays, and that allows the lithium to radiate corkscrew rays. This happens down the whole chain. By the time you get to the middle of the chain, all the cans will start to melt with the heat. And if you can get out of the end of the chain, you'll get massive amounts of gravity waves. And those gravity waves can be used for a multitude of things. For example, 2 years ago, scientists working at Yale University needed to find a way of moving electrons around inside semiconductor devices, nano devices. They couldn't use tweezers because they were too big. They couldn't use pliers because they're too big. But they found out if they used light, infrared light, they could move the electron to the left. And if they put the same light and split it and put it down a beam splitter and change the phase of it by 180 degrees, then when the light came out, they could shine it on the electron and it would move to the right instead of to the left. So they have no idea that they had actually discovered gravity radiation and anti-gravity radiation. They don't know that. They just think it's infrared light. Yeah. I know it's gravity radiation and anti-gravity radiation. Now, once we start to look at molecular bonding, we realize that physics and chemistry, again, they don't know what they're doing. These people haven't got a clue what's involved. When it comes to bonding materials, why do materials bond together? There's 3 schools of thought for the 3 different methods that we think we understand. The first one is ionic bonding, and that's when you get a positively charged atom and a negatively charged atom. They attract themselves to each other. So if you get something like sodium and chlorine, where you've got one atom is positive and one is negative, because one's got too many electrons and one's got too many protons, then they will attract each other and form salt or sodium chlorine. That's a way atoms of different types bond together. It's one way. Another type is covalent bonding, and that's where the electrons on the outside of atoms, they bond to the atom next door to it. They lasso the atom next door to it, and so they share electrons, and that's called covalent bonding. It's named after St. Valentine, who we know is responsible for the bonding of aficionados or lovers. He brings the lovers together, and the atoms bring themselves together. So we call it covalent bonding after St. Valentine. Now, people say, well, that's all very well, but how do hydrogen atoms bond to other atoms? Because if they're going to give up one of the electrons and share it with their neighbor, lasso their neighbor, and sort of draw a figure 8 to keep them together, if that happens, what happens to the hydrogen atom? It splits down the middle. It's only got one electron. It can't give one up to share it with its neighbor. It can't go to its neighbor's party next door if it's only got one. So everybody recognizes that hydrogen must bond differently, but nobody knows how. They call it hydrogen bonding. That's the most conservative of observers. The others think it doesn't happen that way at all. It just does. They say it just does. That's the end of it. Now, given that hydrogen cannot bond covalently and it cannot bond ionically, there must be another way of bonding. And what I've discovered is it bonds gravitationally. It bonds because it generates gravity waves. It's drawn to the other atom through corkscrew radiation. That's how hydrogen actually bonds. And once we realize that, then we can pass this anti-gravity that they discovered at Yale University when they passed it through a beam splitter, changed the phase by 180 degrees. We've got the opposite of the gravity. What happens is the hydrogen bonding breaks down. So we can separate water by bombarding it with gravity waves, and that will split up the hydrogen and the oxygen. Now, of course, that will give us unlimited hydrogen to power cars with for the future. So it's an unlimited source of free energy.
Yes.
And it's free because all you have to do is have one of each of the elements and stack it up. Of course, you have to stack it up vertically, otherwise the gravity waves from the Earth will interfere with the mechanism. But as long as you stack all these elements up with hydrogen at the top or water at the top, then all of this energy will come down towards the Earth, and you'll get terrific amounts of energy for free, for nothing. It's quite straightforward. Yeah. Now, one of the problems with this is that if hydrogen is bonding through gravity waves, and gravity waves travel at the speed of light, because they are electromagnetic after all in nature, it's just that they're shaped as a corkscrew instead of as a right angle. Now, if the tissue in our body is comprised of blood and water, then all of our cells in our body are bonded using hydrogen bonding. So if therefore you bombard a body with anti-gravity radiation, it will disintegrate. So the same light that those physicists use to move the electrons around in the nano devices, if it was shone onto living tissue, it would cause a disintegration of that tissue because the hydrogen bonds would fail. So there we have laser weapons technology. It's there.
Yeah.
So you're saying, how do I feel about the physicists ignoring my work? I know the Chinese and the Russians will have phaser weapons within 12 months of today. Then they'll sit up and listen. You see, normally they would never accept this stuff for 50 years until they're all dead. When they're all dead, the young generation comes up. They say, hey, guys, look, we haven't made one discovery in 150 years. Something's wrong. So why don't we accept this alternative model? But the guys today, all of the literature, all of the books that are available on physics were written by them. They're never going to agree to giving up what they believe in, because it means that everything they studied at college was worthless. It was a total waste of time. Their degrees aren't worth the paper they're written on, and they're all out of a job tomorrow. So they're never going to accept new ideas, and that's why it always takes 50 years. But on this instance, I've had orders for my book from NASA in America, and I've had orders from the Chinese government in China. I know who's buying the book. I've sold thousands of the copies in the last few weeks. It's now on its second edition. It's on the first reprint edition. I know that the people that are researching free energy and this kind of technology are very interested in what's in the book, and there's no way it can be refuted because, as you say, it's laid out in a way. It's taken me 3 years, don't forget, to lay it out in this way where everybody can understand it. A 12-year-old child can understand it.
Or
That's
even
my
somebody
view.
like me with the mentality of a 12-year-old, I could understand it. I'll tell you though, and as we part company, we're coming to the last 10 minutes or so. there was one section. Now we're going to move away from gravity, and there was one section where you just about lost me, because I was reading and I was like, okay, and I reread it and I kind of went back over it. Let's go back towards the back of the book, okay? Because the book, I suppose we've discovered, is kind of split in two. When you're talking about the lid, when you're talking about the amazing lid, when you're talking about looking at the imagery, right? Let's take a jump to that section. And in order to see some of the things that you see, you have to, and you explain this in great depth, you use transparencies and you manipulate the images and you can find things then. That made me wonder as a reader, oh, now is he reaching? Are you reaching when you're at that section? I mean, talk to me a little bit about that process. How did you, tell me about that process.
The reason I call it the amazing lid of Palenque is because it's amazing. And yes, it's miraculous. And yes, it's very, very difficult to imagine how a human being could have encoded it.
Yes.
But the evidence is overwhelming. And it doesn't leave room for ambiguity because of the way they come at it. In other words, if you're in a boat and you're approaching an estuary and you get a fix on a beacon, all it tells you is you're somewhere along that line. If you get a fix from another beacon on the opposite bank, then it gives you a cross, an X, and you're in the middle of the cross. It tells you the chances are you're dead on that cross. And the more beacons you get, the more intersections you get, and the closer and closer and closer you get to the truth of where you are. And the same thing happens with the decoding. It comes at you from 3 or 4 different directions, which precludes ambiguity. Now, once you understand that Lord Paikal was a miracle maker, and once you understand what the Maya believed, what he taught, like Jesus, if you like, that we are spiritual beings, body and soul, we are a mirror image, left and right, then they taught what was good becomes bad and what's bad becomes good. And what that means is, for example, is that if you work hard and suffer all year, which is bad, it feels bad at the time because you're worn out and tired. But at the end of the year, you've got a lot to show for the work during the year. On the other hand, if you have a party every day during the year and get drunk, then at the end of the year, you're fat, diseased, and sick. So what's good becomes bad, and what's bad becomes good. And they also believe that what's missing is not missing, and what's not missing is missing. In other words, the most important thing about a human being is the soul, but you can't see it. It appears to be missing, but it's there. And you've got to look for it, but you can't look for it unless you know it's there and what you're looking for. So once we start to decode the lid in steps, and again, this took many years. It didn't just take 3 years like gravity. The amazing lid of Palenque was 10 times more difficult to discover than gravity. No question about that. I mean, gravity was a tea party, vicarage tea party.
Well, particularly as you explain it, because in your explanation, it's just obvious.
It's obvious. It is obvious. But when you've done
instinctive. You very correctly removed intelligence, I think, and removed intellect, and then it becomes an instinctive, obvious kind of thing. But yeah, with the lid, it's different. There's a lot of work went into that, and I can see that in the pages.
When you've done an apprenticeship on the lid of Palenque, you can cope with anything. And and the amazing lid of Palenque, this is the lid that covered the sarcophagus of Lord Paikal in his pyramid.
Yes, I should have said, because we really haven't talked about it. But yeah, and again, it's ornate. It's rich with imagery.
Yeah. It's 12 feet long. It's 8 foot wide. It's a foot deep. It weighs over 5 tons. It's solid limestone. It's carved, and the carving on the pattern, when you decode it, turns into more than 100 secret stories, 100 secret pictures, which explains why we live, why we die, who Lord Paikal was, what heaven is, what hell is, how to get to heaven, and so on. Now, it's the Rosetta Stone of Maya carving. Once you break the code of the amazing lid of Palenque, you can then decode all of their other treasures, which include paintings on the walls, jewelry, mosaic masks, and things like that, architecture. Once you crack the lid of Palenque, everything else just unlocks, and you can see everything for what it is. And then we see that Lord Paikal tells us that in a previous life, he was Jesus, Buddha, Tutankhamun, and all of these super gods.
Okay. Coming to the end of the show, coming to the end of the book, so many things that we didn't get to touch on because we just don't have time and there's so much material in there. as I said, what leaped out at me reading it, the idea that you can mathematically explain astrology. That really, I thought that was great, that little section. Coming to the end of the book, you mathematically can give us an equation with regard to heaven and hell and God. Mathematically.
Yes.
That's
E equals
stunning.
MC squared.
That's, and you rationalise it out in the closing pages. And it is quite stunning. It's...
You see, Albert Einstein, he never realized that what his equation meant. He didn't even realize at the time that it would lead to the atom bomb. You know, that came later with the Second World Los Alamos project, Second World War project in New Mexico with the, I forget the guy's name now, Oppenheimer and his crew. Yep. And he didn't, and he had no idea that it would lead to an explanation of what God is. But E equals MC squared explains perfectly what God is, and very simply.
Okay, we're going to move away from the book. I think that alone will pique people's curiosity for future science. Definitely worth reading. Before you go, always like to talk to the guests in the last few minutes. It's always interesting to know what you yourself bring to the table, and some of your traits really come out, because the big thing that a lot of our guests have in common, big thing that a lot of our listeners have in common, is that by putting forward messages and ideas that run contrary to what's perceived as accepted or what is the norm, you sometimes get a lot of criticism, and coping with that can sometimes be an issue. You really come across as a guy who doesn't give a damn, because you put your stuff out there, and when they reject it, you think, well, in time it'll come. What fuels that attitude? Because you don't get stressed and upset. You seem like you just go, right, fair enough, I'll move on. How do you do that?
It's a question of duty, really. I'm familiar with all the scriptures of the Bhagavad Gita and the Bible and stuff, and I don't do the book because I want to do it, and I don't do it for personal gain. I do it because that's what I came to do, and I've done what I came to do, and people aren't going to... I don't dislike people because they're not bright enough. I'm talking about the physicists now.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
You know, I don't dislike them for behaving like they are, because they're normal people, and normal people made the world the way it is. That doesn't concern me. My work is not for normal people. My work is for exceptional people, and exceptional people have no trouble with this, and that's because exceptional people are old souls, whereas normal people are young souls. A 30-year-old today, if he's a young soul, will be 30 years old, his soul. But some souls are thousands of years old. They've been here before. They've had kids before. They've been slaves before. And now they know there's more. This might be their 50th time they've lived, and they're ready to increase their soul voltage, escape the gravitational and magnetic pull of the earth, and go to heaven this time around. They know that E equals MC squared, and that this physical world is hell. We are living in hell now. And they know that what they have to do is escape. And the way to escape is to love your neighbor, to love God. This is what it tells us in the Bible, and forgive those around us. And as long as you do that, there's an excellent chance you'll go to heaven. You will escape this hell and you won't come back. If we fail to do that, all of the ancient treasures from the Maya and the Egyptians and the ancient Chinese, the Celts and so on, tells us that if we're not perfect this time around, if our voltage doesn't increase inside us, then when the voltage is released from the soul, it will reattach to some other living creature. Now, it could be a tree or a butterfly or a worm or a dog. It doesn't matter. It depends on whether we've been good or bad in this life. And this is why the Maya said this life is illusion, because my soul is inside me at this time, but in 50 years' time, it might be inside something else that's alive. So, every living thing is God in disguise. That's all it is. Every living thing is God in disguise. And that's why this life is illusion. We see things as grass and trees and frogs and human beings, but it's not like that. God is inside every living thing. It's the only way it can work. And if we have the intelligence now, because we're higher up the food chain, we have the intelligence to realize that we are spiritual beings, and if we increase our voltage, we can get a halo around our head, and we can escape from this hell and become one with God again in the heavens.
Fantastic. I could not ask for better closing words. Maurice Cotterill, a pleasure to read Future Science. I really enjoyed it. I was sitting in the park last weekend, glorious sunshine, devouring it. Pleasure to speak to you. We only touched on half or maybe 3/4 of the stuff that's in there. Really would urge people to check out your work if they are unfamiliar with your work. Many of our listeners, of course, will know your work. Again, a pleasure. Thank you for making time for us today. What's next for you? What's next?
Well, I did decide that I wouldn't be doing any more research, but it's difficult to switch the brain off. I'm discovering things now. I understand how gravity works. I can understand how tornadoes are caused. I can understand what music is, why there are, why the octave makes us feel good or bad, the vibrations.
Okay.
And so all of these things are coming through me now all the time. I don't know if I'll ever write them down, but it's fascinating. I'm happy to talk about them. But there's many, many spin-offs from the book.
Okay, well, we really will reach out to you again. We'll try and get you back. Shane will get you back because it was a great show. I'm sure everyone will love it. Thank you again for making time for us today. Wishing you continued success. I hope you do write those things down, but whatever you do, you're on an amazing journey yourself, and it's just a privilege that you shared it. You've shared it with us through books and sharing your knowledge. A real privilege for us. Thank you very much, Marius.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Bye-bye now.
And I hope that you enjoyed that because I loved it. I really did. I found the whole thing. I loved it. Just loved it. The website, I'm going to spell it out for you. MauriceCotterell.com. MauriceCotterell.com. And you can find out a bit more about that gentleman and his work and his book, Future Science, his latest book, Future Science. We'll put that link, of course, on our blog, as we always do, irishsideofthemoon.blogspot.com, where we archive the shows. They're also on iTunes. We are on Twitter, if you wish to follow us, twitter.com, irishsideofmoon. And as I always say, we're on the Facebook platform as well, facebook.com, irishsideofthemoon. And lots of stories related to what we cover on the show posted there, and people commenting and posting their own links and stories and comments and things as well. Active community, great. And that brings me to the end of number 82. As is always the case, if you've downloaded this, thank you for your time, and if you've found it worthwhile, then please consider passing it on or sharing the information, sharing the link or whatever. If you're listening on any of the community radio stations carrying the show at the moment, stay tuned. We will be right back after the break, after the music rather. We'll dive into our archive and play some of a previous interview, and that will take us to the top of the hour. In either case, thank you again for your time. I hope you found it useful. I hope you found it informative. Hope it has you asking questions and theorizing and challenging maybe some of your beliefs and stuff. I hope it's useful, really do. Thanks, bye.
We are Irish Side of the Moon. Freedom of information, personal empowerment. The Irish Side of the Moon.
I still have a dream.
This is just a ride. We can change it anytime we want. It's only a choice. No effort, no work, no job, no savings of money. A choice right now between fear and love.
Freedom of information, personal empowerment. The Irish Side of the Moon.